On November 7, 1986, police in Garland, Texas, responded to a disturbance call at a house in the 3600 block of Colbath Street. Inside, they found a 37-year-old woman dead from multiple stab wounds. A kitchen knife lay near her body. DNA from an unknown male was found at the scene. That DNA sat in evidence storage for 37 years before anyone could match it to a name. This is what happened. Her name was Barbara Faye Villarreal. She was 37 years old and lived with her husband in a house on Colbath Street in Garland, a suburb about 20 miles northeast of Dallas. The couple had no children. Barbara's maiden name was Carr, and she had a brother named Mark Dunderman, who was 19 years old at the time of her murder. Their mother was in her mid-50s. They were close. Mark looked up to his older sister and stayed in regular contact with her. Garland in the mid-1980s was a working-class suburb east of Dallas with a population of about 140,000 people. The houses were affordable and the streets were quiet enough that people knew when something was wrong. Colbath Street was a residential block in a neighborhood of single-story homes with small yards and driveways. Neighbors recognized each other's cars and noticed when things sounded different. On the evening of November 7th, 1986, something sounded different enough that someone called the police. Officers responded to a disturbance call at the Villarreal house. When they got inside, they found Barbara on the floor. She had been stabbed multiple times with a kitchen knife that came from inside the house. The killer hadn't brought a weapon with him. He had used one of Barbara's own knives. Again, there was no one else in the house when police arrived. The front door was unlocked. There were no signs of forced entry, which suggested that Barbara had either let the person in or that the person had access to the house on his own. The investigation detectives launched a homicide investigation immediately. They processed the crime scene, photographed the knife, documented Barbara's injuries, and collected blood evidence from throughout the house. Blood that didn't belong to Barbara had been left at the scene in multiple locations, which meant the killer had been cut or injured during the attack. Barbara may have fought back, or the killer may have cut himself on the blade during the stabbing. Either way, he left his own blood behind. In 1986, DNA testing was still in its earliest stages. Genetic fingerprinting had only been published 2 years earlier. The samples were the most important thing detectives recovered, but they had no way to identify who they belonged to. They preserved it carefully, sealed it in storage, and moved on to working the case with what they had. In a case where a married woman is found murdered inside her home, the investigation starts with the husband. That's standard procedure. Detectives interviewed Barbara's husband extensively and ran him through every check available. They verified his alibi for the evening, talked to people who could confirm his whereabouts, and looked at whether there had been any domestic disputes, financial problems, or insurance motives. He cooperated with the investigation throughout. He answered every question they asked him. He was eventually cleared, and that left the field wide open. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors up and down the block and talking to anyone who might have seen or heard something on the evening of November 7th. The neighbor who had called in the disturbance was interviewed in detail. Detectives asked about unfamiliar vehicles that night, about people walking through the area, about any sounds coming from the Villarreal house before the call was made. They went back a second time to re-interview residents who hadn't been home during the first canvass. They talked to people who knew Barbara from work, from the neighborhood, and from social circles. They tried to build a timeline of her last hours, starting from when she was last seen alive. They looked at anyone who had access to the house, anyone who had a reason to be there, anyone who had been seen in the area that night. They checked whether Barbara had been involved in any disputes or whether anyone in her life had expressed anger or resentment toward her. They ran down every lead that came in during the first weeks of the case. None of them led to a suspect. The department also coordinated with the FBI early in the investigation. The Villarreal family had ties in both the United States and Mexico, which meant the suspect pool extended beyond the reach of a single police department in a Dallas suburb. Investigators tracked leads in both countries over the years that followed. Some went into neighborhoods in the Dallas area, some went south into towns where relatives lived. Detectives made calls to law enforcement agencies in Texas border towns and sent inquiries through federal channels. And they asked about anyone connected to the Villarreals who had a history of violence or who had traveled to the Dallas area around the time of the murder. They checked records on both sides of the border for anyone with outstanding warrants or a pattern of violent behavior. None of the leads produced a name that matched the evidence found at the scene. The fact that there had been no forced entry pointed towards someone Barbara knew, but that didn't narrow the field enough. The Villarreal family was large, with relatives spread across Texas and south of the border. Any number of people could have had access to the house or been familiar enough to walk in without raising alarm. Detectives looked at relatives on both sides of the border, checking for anyone with a history of violence or anyone who had been in the area on the night of the murder. 2 years after Barbara was murdered, her husband was killed in a shootout in Mexico. The year was 1988. The circumstances of his death were never fully explained in public reporting. The family lost 2 people in 2 years, both violently, one in her own home in Garland and the other south of the border. Whatever the husband might have known about conflicts among relatives, about people who had a reason to be angry, about tensions that might have escalated into violence, he took it with him when he died. The one person who had been closest to Barbara and might have helped investigators narrow the suspect pool was gone. His death also raised questions for investigators about whether the 2 killings were connected, whether someone had a motive to eliminate both of them. Those questions were never publicly answered. The threads of the case led south, but they didn't lead anywhere investigators could follow from a police department in a Dallas suburb. When CODIS came online in 1998, 12 years after the murder, the DNA profile from the crime scene was entered into the system. CODIS is the FBI's national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders. If the person who left DNA at a crime scene has been convicted of a qualifying offense and required to submit a sample, the system flags a match. For cold cases with preserved biological evidence, it was the first real chance to connect old crime scenes to known offenders. The search returned nothing. Yet the man who left his DNA at the scene had no criminal record in the United States that required a submission. He was living in another country, beyond the reach of a database that only tracked American offenders. The profile ran automatically against every new entry in the database for years after it was submitted. Every year, the same result. The case went cold. The file sat in the department's records while the years accumulated. Different detectives inherited it as officers retired or transferred. Each one reviewed the evidence, checked whether any new matches had come through the system, and put the file back. Each time, the same answer: no match. The profile ran against every new entry added to the national database. Nothing ever came back. The detectives who had originally worked the case retired, and the neighborhood turned over as houses changed hands. The people who had called in the disturbance that night moved away or died. The leads that had been generated in the first years of the investigation had all been run down and exhausted. There was nothing new to pursue. Barbara's brother, Mark, had been 19 years old when she was killed. He was barely out of adolescence when he lost his older sister. He grew up carrying the question of who had done this and why. He finished school, started a career, built a life of his own, and the question followed him through all of it. Their mother aged from a woman in her 50s into a woman in her 80s and then her 90s without ever hearing an answer. She had buried her daughter and then spent nearly 4 decades waiting for someone to tell her who had put her there. Yet Mark and his mother called the detective's office over the years, asked if there was anything new, and heard the same answer each time. They watched the decades pile up without a single development in the case. Mark went from being a teenager to a man in his 20s, then his 30s, then his 40s and 50s, with the same unanswered question sitting in the background of his life. Their mother outlived the detectives who had originally worked the case. She outlived the neighbors who had called in the disturbance on the night Barbara was killed. She kept waiting. The loss of Barbara's husband in 1988 had compounded the grief. The question of whether the deaths were connected hung in the air alongside the question of who had killed Barbara. Nobody had answers to either question. Yet the case file sat at the police department while Mark and his mother carried it in their own way, year after year. The case sat in the police files for 37 years. That's longer than Barbara had been alive. In 2023, cold case investigators at the Garland Police Department submitted the evidence from the 1986 crime scene for genetic genealogy analysis. Every traditional method of solving the case had been tried and had failed. The DNA profile had been in CODIS for 25 years without producing a match. The samples had been preserved since the night of the murder, sealed in storage since 1986. A forensic laboratory extracted a full DNA profile from the sample and uploaded it to public ancestry databases. databases. Genetic genealogy works on a different principle than CODIS. Instead of matching crime scene DNA against convicted offenders, it looks for biological relatives of the unknown person in public ancestry databases. If anyone in those databases shares enough DNA with the crime scene sample, it means they're related to whoever left it. The profile doesn't need to match the killer directly, it just needs to match someone among his relatives. From there, investigators build a family tree using public records, birth certificates, and marriage documents until the branches narrow to a specific person. One of the killer's relatives had uploaded their DNA to an ancestry database. That person was tracing their own heritage and had no idea the DNA they submitted would connect to a decades-old murder case in a Dallas suburb. But the profile was close enough to the crime scene sample to flag a biological connection. Some investigators used that match as a starting point and built a genealogical tree outward, tracing births, marriages, deaths, and addresses through years of public records. The branches narrowed over weeks of research until they pointed to a specific branch with ties to both Texas and the regions south of it. The trail led to the Canales family, and within that family, one person was connected to Barbara Villarreal by marriage. His name was Liborio Canales. He was the brother of Barbara's husband, her brother-in-law. He had been approximately 48 years old at the time of the murder in 1986. He was someone who had known Barbara, who had been inside the house on Colbath Street before, who had sat in the kitchen where the knife came from. He would have been familiar enough to walk through the front door without raising alarm, while the lack of forced entry that had puzzled investigators for years suddenly made sense. Barbara hadn't let in a stranger. She had let in someone she recognized, someone she had no reason to be afraid of. After the killing, Canales had left the country and stayed there for years. To every law enforcement system in the United States, he didn't exist. He had lived an entire second life while the evidence from the crime scene sat in a storage room in Texas with no name attached to it. The genetic genealogy connected the blood on the floor of the house to a man who had been living in another country since the week of the murder. Naming him and arresting him were two different problems. Canales was south of the border. American investigators had no authority there. They couldn't cross the border and arrest him. They needed him to come to them. Over the decades, Canales had settled into a routine that included periodic trips north. He sometimes stayed at a home in Lovington, New Mexico, a small town in Lee County near the Texas state line. Lovington is about 300 miles west of Dallas, in the oil country of southeastern New Mexico. Canales came north when he had people to see, when there was a birthday or a holiday worth crossing for. The rest of the time, he stayed in Mexico. He had been making these trips for years without incident. Investigators learned about this pattern through the genealogical research and subsequent investigation. They identified the house in Lovington, confirmed that Canales came north for gatherings and holidays, and determined approximately when the next occasion would be and where he would stay. But the Garland Police Department coordinated with the FBI and the Lovington Police Department to set up surveillance on the house. They had his name, the DNA match, and a warrant. All they needed was for him to cross into New Mexico. On July 17, 2023, Canales crossed from Mexico into New Mexico. He was 85 years old. He was coming to celebrate his birthday at the house in Lovington. It was the kind of trip he had made many times before, a routine crossing for a gathering with people he hadn't seen in a while. On July 18th, 2023, one day after he crossed, officers from the Lovington Police Department arrested him without incident at the house. The arrest was coordinated between the FBI, Garland detectives, and local officers in New Mexico. Canales was booked into the Lee County Detention Center on a warrant for murder. He had walked into the country voluntarily for a birthday celebration, and he wasn't going to walk back out. While in custody, Canales admitted to killing Barbara Villarreal. He told detectives he had done it because he was angry about a dispute within the extended family. He didn't fight the charges or ask for a lawyer before speaking. He told them what happened. After 37 years, the answer was a confession, given voluntarily in a detention center in southeastern New Mexico. The motive was an argument between relatives. It ended with Canales walking into his brother's house, picking up a kitchen knife, and stabbing his sister-in-law to death. On March 12, 2024, Liborio Canales pleaded guilty to the murder of Barbara Faye Villarreal in a Dallas County courtroom. He was 86 years old. Nearly 38 years had passed since the night on Coldbath Street. The guilty plea meant there would be no trial, no jury selection, no witness testimony, no cross-examination. Just an 86-year-old man standing in front of a judge and admitting in court what he'd already told the detectives in Lovington 8 months earlier. The sentence was 20 years in a Texas prison. At 86, that sentence means he'll die behind bars. He had spent nearly 4 decades as a free man after the murder, most of them living south of the border while the evidence from the crime scene sat in a storage room at the police department. The 20-year sentence was the result of a guilty plea agreement. There was no trial. Dallas County Criminal District Attorney John Creuzot said investigative genetic genealogy is no longer the future of solving violent crimes. It is very much the present. He said Dallas continues to be a national leader in using the technology. Lead prosecutor Leighton D'Antoni said they had a formula that brings repeated success solving cases that once seemed unsolvable. The conviction was the first in Dallas County history secured through investigative genetic genealogy. Barbara's family was in the courtroom. Her mother was sitting among them. She was 93 years old. She had outlived her daughter by 38 years. She had been in her mid-50s when Barbara was killed, and she had spent the years since then waiting for an answer that most people in her position give up on ever hearing. She sat in that courtroom and watched the man who killed her daughter stand up and say he did it. Mark Dunderman was there too. He was 56 years old now. He had carried the question since he was 19, through his entire adult life. The answer was a name he already knew. The man who killed his sister was someone who had been part of the same household, someone who had sat at the same table. Mark had spent 37 years not knowing that the person responsible was someone his family had known all along. The family said they will never let him occupy their thoughts again, and the life he lived should be considered a gift. Barbara Villarreal was 37 years old. She was killed in her own kitchen by a man who had sat at her table. Her mother was 93 when she finally heard his name. If you enjoyed this case, go check out the other solved cases in the playlist.